Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hello and welcome to episode 160 of the podcast. In this episode, I talk with Kristen Ivy all about the new book, It's Personal, that she co-wrote with Reggie Joyner and Virginia Ward. And we talk all about what's in the book, how does that apply to our ministries. I try to not just cover the 5 questions that are, that the book is all about, but also what's behind that. What was personal for Kristen in, what she wrote in that book? What did that look like for her even growing up? And then what does it look like now as a leader? So we dug into that. It's a great interview. Always love talking with Kristen. And you can get the links and notes and all that at nickblevins.com/episode 160. In addition to that, I want to give 2 books away. And here's what I want to do. Post on social media and Instagram, Facebook, Twitter about this episode of the podcast, but also mention somebody that made it personal for you, who invested in you and your faith. Maybe it was when you were a kid or a student or as an adult. Maybe you'll even tag them because you know them and you can tag them in this update. But I'd love for you to share that you're listening to this podcast and we're talking about It's Personal and who made it personal for you. And I'll pick 2 people this week and you'll get a free book copy of the book, It's Personal. Make sure you tag me in that post so I see it when I'm picking 2 people to win that. Now, before we jump into the interview, I want to let you know about Volunteer Boot Camp. I mentioned this last week. It's an online event we're hosting with Ministry Boost. It's completely free, where we're going to talk all about volunteers, recruiting, onboarding, encouraging, training, developing coaches and leaders, and a structure around that, and retaining volunteers, which is really important too. I'm excited about the voices we have that are going to be a part of that, with Dan Scott, Nina Schmidgall, Paula Danielle, John Berkmeyer, Christine Kreischer. These are great voices to speak about those topics, all about leading volunteers. Not everything about volunteers. There's so much we could do, but probably the key pieces. So I'm excited about that. It is Wednesday, August 28th, 1 p.m. Eastern. So whatever time zone that is for you, it'll be a 2.5-hour online event, 6 different sessions where we'll hit each of those topics, take some questions and answers after those voices get to speak on that and kind of teach something for us to apply in our ministry. You can learn more and register at ministryboost.org/bootcamp. All right, let's go ahead now and listen to my conversation with Kristen Ivy about It's Personal. Well, it's good to have Kristen Ivy back on the podcast. Welcome back, Kristen.
Nick, it's so good to be here.
So tell us, what's been going on with you the last 2 years. I don't know exactly how long ago it was that you were on the podcast, but it feels like a long time. It feels like 2 years plus. Anything new?
There's always something new. There's something new every week here at Orange and where I work and in my family. Just a minute ago, right before we started recording, I was telling you what's new with me as a mom, where my daughter just had kind of a accident on a bike. And so I spent the night in the ER. I don't know. Life is always new, right?
Yeah. You don't want that kind of new, though. You were showing me the pictures. It's pretty rough. Your poor daughter. What a chant.
Yeah, she is. She's pretty tough. It's
with
amazing.
School starting around the corner. It's like the worst thing and she's 8. Is that what you said?
She's turning 8. Yeah,
she's
about to turn 8.
Yeah. Old enough to be aware that, scars and scabs and all that from a fall.
The first thing she said is, I'm going to look funny. I said, you're going to be just fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man. Well, it's good to have you back on the podcast. Yeah. I could have you on like every few months and we could talk about new things you're working on, different things. And today we're talking about the new book, It's Personal, which if anybody went to the Orange Conference, they got to hear a lot of that, not just the main sessions, but kind of woven throughout. And I want to start with this though. In the book, Zacchaeus is the example. So tell us, what do you think about his story illustrates this idea of It's Personal so well?
Yeah, his story is what we anchored everything to because it's such a fascinating story. And in a lot of ways, we reduce it down to this kid's song that most of us have heard. And that's when you think of Zacchaeus, you think of the kid's song, you kind of think of a little Sunday school lesson, and that's sort of where we wrap it. But the Zacchaeus encounter is actually the last encounter Jesus has with anybody before he goes into Jerusalem for the crucifixion. So this is the last ministry opportunity that he has. And if you look, just kind of back up and take a big picture look at the story of Jesus, you watch his ministry unfold, and there's a little bit of an intensity, as you might imagine, right there toward the end. And so Lazarus, he's coming off of having just raised, his friend from the dead. And here he is going, he's leaving that encounter. He has to kind of go into hiding because it was so threatening right, to the church in Jerusalem that he had just done this huge miracle. He goes into hiding and then comes out of hiding to come into the triumphal entry. And that's where he sees Zacchaeus on the road. And so there's this crescendo moment. There's so much going on. Jesus is at the height of his ministry. And yet he pauses to look up at a tree and sees this tax collector who everybody despises and does the most unexpected thing that anybody could imagine by calling him out by name, inviting himself over to this guy's house for lunch. You know, people are going, why are you doing this? I mean, you can just imagine it from so many different perspectives in the story, whether it's the disciples kind of wondering, what on earth are you doing? Why are you pausing here? Why are you talking to this man? Maybe from the perspective of Matthew, who was a tax collector himself, kind of looking on to go, okay, well, hey, how are you going to treat this guy? Because he's kind of like me at heart. To Zacchaeus going, oh my goodness, you know who I am. And it changes everything about his life. And so there just were some principles we found in that story that felt like they set the trajectory for what the church really should be about and what ministry can look like if we're following Jesus' example.
Yeah. And early in the book, and it's written by you, Reggie, and Virginia Ward, and sometimes you say, I, Kristen, or I, Reggie, like you can tell the difference. Yeah. In fact, some of the questions I want to ask were specific things I know you wrote. And I don't know who talked about this early in the book, but it starts kind of challenging us not to be shallow in leading kids and leading students. But I thought I'd ask, what do you think are some practical handles for what's shallow, you know, and what's personal for small group leaders leading kids and students?
Well, I think for a long time, we have this kind of thing we say in the church where we say that we don't want to be shallow. And the answer to that has been we want to go deeper. And so you'll hear conversations, how do we go deeper? And a lot of times what we mean by that is maybe deeper in our understanding of Scripture. Maybe we learn Hebrew or we learn Greek or we learn how to, you know, dissect passages of Scripture, or those kinds of things are going deeper. And we miss the essence of what Jesus seemed to say that this was about, that the opposite of shallow might be personal. That we really do set our agenda aside and set some things to the side and make it as personal as we can, because ministry is, it's very personal. You're talking about somebody's eternal salvation. You're talking about their soul. You're talking about their faith in a higher power. I mean, so many aspects of that are extremely personal. And yet we miss the personal aspects of ministry when we make it about information and not about other people. And so we're challenging leaders, no matter what your influence is. You may be an executive pastor, senior pastor, teaching pastor, youth pastor, children's pastor, volunteer, small group leader, like you're saying, wherever you sit in ministry, if you're doing the work of the church, you don't want to miss this idea that in order to not be shallow, you need to be more personal. And I think part of that is challenging us to think about what's going on in other people's lives. I know for me, for example, being called into ministry means that you feel like you're called to the most important work on the planet, that everybody should understand that the work you do matters more than anything else because it's eternal and it's spiritual and it's all these things. And so if we're not careful, it's easy for us to start to act like, well, if you guys understood prioritization, you would prioritize the work I do above anything else you do because what I do matters more, right? I mean, that's kind of a confession.
Mm-hmm. That's a volunteer recruitment pitch right there.
But there's that piece that you go, well, I signed up to do this because this is the work that really matters. And if you understood life, you would understand that this really matters better, more than anything else you're doing.
Sure.
But when we make it personal, it does require us to kind of pause for a minute and think about the families that we're interacting with, the parents we're interacting with, the kids we're interacting with, and really try to do the work of empathy to put ourselves in their shoes, understand what's going on. And it's kind of a mindset shift that can radically alter everything about your approach to your message or your programming or your encounters or the way you even just view your time.
Mm-hmm. And the book talks about 5 questions you should answer to give every kid hope. They're questions that, make it more personal. You get to know them. And I imagine, though, there are a lot of leaders who could be, I don't know if good's the right word, but think they're good small group leaders or something, because maybe they're teaching in some way or they're showing up early, they're prepared. But there really is a difference to being personal and getting to know kids. Like the way I think about it is before I ever, was my eyes were open to I'll call it the lead small strategy as you do, or investing relationally. My wife and I, before we were married, when we were like 20 years old, we taught a 7th grade Sunday school class. And with nobody ever telling me one way or the other, I just kind of did it like I was taught when I grew up. I taught. I was a teacher.
Yeah.
Like that was the role I filled. And in hindsight, it was a huge missed opportunity because yes, on one hand, I was supposed to wear a bunch of hats, teacher, small group leader, all those things. But the most important would have been the one that's the most personal. And I look back on that and I feel like I missed it. And so that's why I like what you're addressing in this book is you can miss it. You could do all these other things that are good and important, but never make it personal.
Right. I mean, there's a tendency, I know, I'm introverted. So part of me always prefers a task list because I can go down the task list. I can check off the pieces and it doesn't really cost me anything, really of myself. It's less vulnerable than getting connected relationally to people who might disappoint you or you might disappoint them. So there's this risk involved in a personal relationship and you kind of have to lay aside a lot of preconceived notions and enter into somebody else's story, asking more questions than you do providing answers and going, I really care about you, getting to know you, and opening yourself up to the risk that they might get to know you back. I mean, all of that is a little bit scary. And I think it's something we don't talk a lot about in ministry. And we could kind of go through layers of that. But if we're not careful, a lot of times we can drift toward a kind of performance in ministry that says that you as the pastor, as the minister, as the volunteer need to get your stuff in order to have credibility. And there's a layer to which that's true, but there's also a piece of that may not ever be fully resolved. And we're all still on this journey. Getting personal means being able to say, hey, I'm in this with you. I'm not maybe perfect. I'm figuring life out. I've got my flaws and my junk and my stuff, and you've got yours. But we're all pursuing an authentic relationship with God. And here's what I've kind of learned along the way, and help me understand what you've learned along the way as we read scripture together and have, quiet times together and pray together and spiritual practices together. But that we can be vulnerable enough with each other to really be authentic and be relational in a real sense.
And I imagine some people hearing that think about maybe being an adult in relationships with other adults, where you can be open and vulnerable. But then you start talking about kids and students, especially if I'm a small group leader, and there could be a hesitancy, right? Like, should I really tell them what I don't know about this, or that I've had doubts about that? But the reality is, like, I always go back to one of our small group leaders years ago when her girls asked her a question, some theological question about the Bible. And she said, I don't know, but we should find out together. In some ways, that moment was better than an answer. It was real. She really didn't know what she thought about that. But that was better than an answer. Like, what do you think about that tension between open and connecting and vulnerable, but you're also leading kids and students where it's probably not, hey, here's a total open book on everything I've ever done or how I feel or whatever. What do you think about that?
I think kids, just like adults, are going to learn from people who don't have all the answers, and they can be intrigued by somebody not having all the answers. And so it's okay to come into that conversation and say, I don't know. Let's figure that out together. Let's take a look in the Bible together. Let's, search on Google together. Let's see if we can look it up. Those things are great. I think there is a tension in working with kids of every age in how much of your story you're going to share with them and how real you're going to be. And one of the questions as a small group leader for me that I used to always try to ask is, how is this helpful for them? So if I'm tempted or feeling like I should share part of my story with a kid, tempted to share my story, that's what I was saying. If I'm tempted to share a part of my story with a teenager, I need to always preface that with, how is this helpful for them, so that I'm not trying to insert myself and my story into a situation where maybe it's more about them sharing their story with me, to kind of, trump the conversation or, hijack the conversation or make it about my story and not about their story. And also, is it appropriate for them at this juncture in their life and what they're going through and what they're sorting through? So there are a lot of really good questions small group leaders should ask before sharing all of their story, right? With a kid, with a teenager, depending on their journey and what's going on with them. And then also making sure it has a point to what is it that you're trying to really ultimately say in that moment to that kid with your story, not just sharing it for sharing its sake.
Mm-hmm. I know one of the areas that you wrote in the book, you talk about and getting to know kids and teenagers personally. You mentioned interviewing counselors about kids in crisis, which I imagine was all part of the PHASE project and the research you were doing there. But tell us about that and those interviews and what you learned from them and the connection here to knowing what matters to a kid or a student.
I'm trying to remember where I referenced the counselor meetings in the book. I know that one of the things I learned from counselors was that every action has a purpose. So every action that a kid is, if they're acting out, if they're being unruly in the classroom, there's always some kind of purpose behind that action. And so when you try to make something personal, you don't just stop at the action you want to correct or the thing you want to change about a kid, but you're looking into it to ask why. And try to ask why maybe 3 layers back. Why do you think they're doing this right now? And why is that the case? And then why might that be? And the more you go back with the question why, the more you might uncover part of that kid's journey or that kid's reality so that it changes the way that you relate to them. Because the more you understand them and their worlds, the world they live in, the pressures they're dealing with, the better you'll be able to kind of frame your encounter with that kid.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, when I read it, I'm not going to remember exactly what you said, but part of the thing that I took away from it was if a kid is in crisis, then what'll help them more is knowing them personally, like having that relationship and the safe place for them, maybe more than even, I don't know, having answers or guiding them through the crisis. It's just the idea that like somebody knows me, somebody cares about me. I remember, I think about it like when we were at the Next event this year. You might remember when Will Hutcherson was saying that as he was doing a lot, and we had him on the podcast recently to talk about this, but a lot of the research he was looking into about depression and despair and all that, a lot of the healing of it was eye contact and appropriate physical touch and just these things that are like, I don't know, maybe it's what you think, maybe it's not what you think, but it makes sense. It makes sense to be known and to be cared for when somebody sees you, all that.
A lot of this book is getting back to making a big deal out of things that are small. And that's why the book opens with knowing a kid's name. And the whole first chapter, and I won't get into all the chapters or all the things, but the first chapter is really dedicated to the idea of knowing somebody's name. And it is looking somebody in the eye and saying their name out loud, shows somebody value, shows somebody respect in a way that you can't just replace with all the other things. And sometimes the other things, creating a great worship set and having great lighting and, good video production and all that. It's awesome, but it really isn't more important or better than knowing a kid's name, looking them in the eye, saying their name, making them feel known, making them feel like they're a big deal personally in a way that maybe big production never can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. How about, for you personally, and some of this is in the book, I think about the teacher that did that thing for you, got you connected to the yearbook writing or something like that. Who knew you personally and influenced you in matters of faith?
I think it's a lot of different people along the way. And for each of us, we all have those names that jump out. One of the things I did at the beginning of the PHASE research was every time I sat down to talk to someone to do an interview, I always asked them the question, who influenced you? And everybody has an answer, which is just fascinating. There's somebody who looked you in the eye, said your name, and they understood something about you, saw potential in you, called something out in you, said, this is something you're good at. And I think that really matters because those are the pieces that, if you're really honest, it probably didn't have to do with, something that cost a lot of money and big production experience, and not to minimize those things, but it was somebody who just took the time to really see you for who you were, and make you feel valued. The story I share in the book is about my middle school history teacher, Catherine Burrows, and she just kind of intersected me at a time when I was crashing, lots of things that were spiraling for me. Around the 8th grade, my parents got divorced. My gymnastics coach was killed in a car accident at like 23 years old. So there were a number of different things that were taking me down a path as a middle school kid. And my grades started dropping. I wasn't doing well in school. I just, those kind of things happen. And she was the only first teacher who sat me down and pointed out my bad grade and said, look, I know that this isn't you. There's something else that's going on in your world because this isn't a reflection of what I know is true about you or what you're capable of. So you need to worry about getting you taken care of before you worry about your grades. And so it was a teacher that went, okay, I'm here to help you get good grades and learn history, but I can tell from your history test that you've got stuff you need to prioritize besides history. And how can we help you be whole and help you be okay as a person? And for me, as an 8th grader, I'd never even thought that. I had never paused to go, wow, I'm crashing. I need to, deal with me right now. I was just like, whatever, Mm-hmm. And so I think it just takes adults who are paying attention to say, maybe this kid is acting out in small group, and it's not because they're a bad kid. Maybe they're struggling with something and they don't know how to express it. Maybe this kid is breaking all the rules and just pushing hard for freedom in a way that's going to hurt them one day. And maybe it's not just because they're a bad kid or they're ornery or whatever, but because there's something else that's going on. And it takes somebody really digging in to get to know that person to figure out what they're going through and how to really help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And all of us probably can think of like adults who influenced our lives or other people and like the moments, the things they said. Like I always remember, I don't even remember exactly how old I was. Maybe I was 18 or something when I was first asked to teach in a VBS class. And I don't even remember what age the kids were. And I never thought about that before, and I did. And then afterwards, they encouraged me. And then I don't feel like that's like teaching is a primary gift of mine or whatever today, but it was probably like the first introduction for me to ever serving, in ministry as a volunteer. And you just look back and wonder what would have been without that. Like, yeah. Who's saying, is every kid, the hope is, I think about my church, and I hope every kid and every student has multiple voices knowing them and saying things like that to them.
And it probably comes out of a belief that we are just a little bit selfish as people. And a lot of times we in the church act like if I tell you the truth, then you'll understand the truth and it will be meaningful for you and everything will go well. And it's just very seldom that any of us are really looking for truth as much as we're looking to matter. And it's kind of a shift to go, if you can make people matter and let them know that they're valued, that they matter to you, that you want to get to know them more. If you can overemphasize that, then you have credibility to talk about the truth together and wrestle with what that means for them and their particular story and those kinds of things. But it's a lot harder work than just teach the truth and everything else will work out.
Mm-hmm. That's always probably been true, but in some ways it feels like it's even more true today, right? Yep. Like I think of phrases like my truth or whatever, just the idea that even absolute truth was probably, I don't know, largely believed to be true years ago. I don't think that's the case anymore. So even the idea that you say something and I'm supposed to just believe it, or my experience is different, so I'm going to redefine that. It probably matters more today that we get the relationships first and the truth second.
Yeah, well, we just sometimes forget what other people are going through in their story. I was talking with a mom friend of mine recently who had gone to a motherhood kind of event that was at a church and was really struggling with it and felt like in the programming it had made an assumption that all moms were kind of in a particular narrow slice of their story and kind of made some assumptions without, it was a well-meaning event, they were trying to help. But I kind of, in my own mind, thinking through the lens of its personal I think as they created, they forgot to pause and even just look at statistics to go, this % of mothers in the room have probably lost a child in the last year. This % of mothers in the room are probably dealing with a special needs diagnosis within the last 12 months. This % of mothers in the room may have a diagnosis for a child who has a terminal illness in the last 12 months. This % of mothers in the room are probably going through a divorce right now. This % of mothers in the room potentially have lost their income and are dealing with economic struggles. So part of it is just going, okay, same thing applies if you're dealing with children, if you're dealing with teenagers, to start thinking through what kids in the room may have been sexually abused in the last year, what percentage of kids in the room maybe. And so when you begin to think about those stories, it changes your messaging, it changes the lens. It's not that it's changing the truth to get back to your example of absolute truth, but your delivery of that truth should change as you get to know people and get to really embrace the stories that they're living out and what's happening in their world. And nothing can do that for you. No book that you read, no podcast you listen to, no, not to, throw shade on the podcast, but nothing can do that for you like getting to know people. The spending time with people convinces you, oh, wow, life is so varied, in our experiences of it, and our stories of it are so varied. And the more people you get to know, more stories you kind of lean into, the more you understand, wow, I know for me, I feel like life has been a progression of knowing, discovering that I was confidently wrong about a lot of things. And even the things I was right about, maybe I was wrong in the way that I talked about them or the way that I, couched it or phrased something.
Yeah. Well, we talked about this a while back. You're like an Enneagram 8-7 or 7-8 or something like that, right?
Yeah, I am.
I'm an 8, but not without the 7. So confidently wrong sounds like a good description of an Enneagram 8, actually.
Yeah, that's probably what that is.
Us. Yeah.
Yeah, you just go
a lot of people
in.
a lot of people could be wrong, but only with conviction. Could we be? I don't know. So I know the other thing, and I don't know that I read this in the book, but I know you have led student groups for some time, groups of middle school or high school girls. So how have you seen this play out in the groups that you've been a part of?
I think I'm listening to you kind of unpack your experience of leading groups, and probably very similar. I went into groups thinking, hey, I will teach you what I've learned about scripture. And then the more I got into groups, I think just realizing, oh, wait, I need to be more relational. And then I think when you get in community with teenagers and then you start discovering things about families, you're going, wait, I think maybe this isn't so much about me teaching them as me just showing up and being present for them and just continuing to reinforce some of the basic things. I went to seminary. I have the MDiv. I did the, Hebrew and Greek, and a lot of that's very helpful because I think it frames my understanding of theology. But my experience leading groups is the most important thing is showing up for a teenager in crisis to go, no, God still loves you. And in order to have the credibility to say that, I have to know them and know what they're experiencing and let them know you can be known and fully known and still be loved. And I'm just going to show up to keep reminding you of that I'm not going to stop caring about you. I'm not going to stop loving you. And neither is God. God has proven that he's not going to let you go just because of this one thing or this incident or what's going on in your life right now. And those feel like the ministry moments that just kind of we keep coming back to and saying, maybe the things that matter most are our ability to show up and keep showing up and be as personal as possible and even be in a learning posture when we show up for kids and teenagers.
Mm-hmm. And you all talk about in the book how knowing the answers to the 5 questions about kids, and we didn't hit them all. I think you may have mentioned one of them, so people need to get the book and read it. But talk about the connection between knowing the answers to the 5 questions and how that gives a kid hope.
Well, yeah. We actually have 5 things that we think that like each question can help a kid have a different aspect of that. But part of it is the authenticity of our message is grounded in our vulnerability to show up and be present with each other in, in a personal kind of relationship. That if you really want the authenticity of the message to come through so that a kid goes, okay, wait, you're not just talking about hope because hope is true, but you really are sitting with me in my reality and in my world and looking out toward my future. And you have hope for me and you demonstrate this kind of hope for me. And it just kind of lends a different kind of credibility to it. So I know you kind of referenced one of the chapters on shame, I think, to break some shame cycles and help kids understand, no, this isn't that we're talking about something that's out there and just theoretical for anybody, but this is real and this is true and this is for you right now. It means that we just have to be a lot closer to them and a lot closer to what they're going through. So it's just I think hope in a personal sense is really what we're talking about.
Yeah. It's kind of good. In some ways, it feels like it relates to what I mentioned about what Will said. When people look you in the eye or appropriate physical touch and they know you and you're seen, that alone just gives you hope about your own future, pulls you out of that despair. How would you recommend, a lot of people listening to this work on staff, leading kids ministry or student ministry or next gen or something like that. How would you recommend church leaders use this resource to help their teams?
Well, we wrote this as a book that we could go to any Christian anywhere because it's a short read. It's really fast. You can knock it out in a day. If you're trying to do hey, I want to read 100 books this year, you should definitely make this one of your reads because it's like a really quick go out for coffee and you're done. So it's really short. I think any volunteer can read it. And hopefully the variety of stories between myself and Virginia and Reggie, something might, strike a line of familiarity with you and your story. The essence of it is just a mindset that we wanted to go a step beyond Lead Small, where we had 5 principles of what it means to practically be a small group leader. This was to kind of come alongside of Lead Small, but to say, okay, you can, again, check all those boxes and miss the essence if you forget that this is about relational ministry. And every single piece of it is anchored to the story of Zacchaeus, just like you said. So it's following what we see Jesus doing when he has his encounter with Zacchaeus. For a minute, we talked about using different encounters of Jesus because this is this pattern throughout his ministry with the woman at the well, with a number of people he encounters. Jesus kind of never fails to make it personal and probably make it personal in a way that makes a lot of other people uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And so it really is rooted in looking at what did Jesus do when he encountered people? And as somebody who knew all the truth, what was kind of his go-to style for ministry? And to just remind ourselves of what are the things that are really simple and so simple that we want to just kind of push them to the side and make those things a big priority again.
Yeah. Well, I love the book, and we were talking with my team a few weeks ago about how can we, help all our leaders learn this stuff. I actually came back. We talked about it in one of our big volunteer huddles after I heard the 5 questions shared before the book was written. But I feel like this is something we definitely want to get in their hands and talk about. And a lot of times one of the things we'll wrestle with is, all of our volunteers aren't small group leaders. There's large group and welcome team and, just admin behind the scenes. There's all kinds of things. But this feels like one of those ones where it's like, it doesn't matter. Somehow you've probably got influence somewhere with other people, maybe even kids and students, regardless of your role. And it would be helpful to you. So we're going to find a way to, use that this fall for sure.
And I think I would say one other thing, even if you weren't encouraging leaders to read this book, I think I would also challenge every volunteer, everybody in ministry really to say, what if you set aside the assumption that we all fall into, and I do this all the time, constantly. This is just always at war kind of in my own self. But set aside the assumption that everybody's story looks like your story. Because the tendency is to assume that everybody's life story is probably a general reflection of your own experience. But to allow people to really surprise you, allow people to really wreck your life view. If you've got something where you're like, I know that this is true for all people because of my experience, just to open the door to the fact that maybe it's time to lean into somebody who's a little different than you, maybe believes differently than you, has a different life experience, and to allow yourself to really be surprised and to change what you think because of the life experience of other people that you get to know. Because I think the learning that seems like for me really challenges me the most and seems to matter the most is the learning that I get just from encounters with people, learning their life stories and their experiences, allowing them. It sounds so horrible. So just, I don't know, forgive me for saying this, but giving them permission to be the expert on their own story, instead of so oftentimes there's a tendency, I know that I'll have to go, oh, I already know about your story, and so I fill in the gaps as if I'm the expert on your story. And then when you tell me something that doesn't jive with that, I'm like, no, I understand your reality better than you do. But to really come to the table and say, wait, you might actually know your own life experience better than I know it. And I'm here to learn from you and listen to you and consider the fact that you might be right about that and that I still have some learning to do, could be some of the most important learning that we have to do as church leaders.
That's true. That's a good word. As we wrap up, I'm wondering, I probably asked you this last time you were on too, what are you working on now that you're excited about, that you can talk about, whether at Orange or, I don't know, on your own or whatever? You always got some plates spinning. So is there something going on that you can talk about?
I have lots of plates spinning. We're about to kick off our tour season, so we're going to be out on the road, talking to leaders about the ideas of It's Personal, and so that's fun and exciting. A few messages that I know that we're really pushing at in a lot of this. Very excited about leaders who are speaking into how to help families with kids with special needs. Our curriculum teams have been working really hard on providing content that can be better used for accommodations for families with kids with special needs. I think there's a lot of ground that we need to cover in that area in ministry, especially as it relates to creating environments that are accessible for all families. Very excited about what's happening with Spanish translation on the ParentQ app. I know that's a side piece. We just launched that, but it's been a dream for at least 10 years. And was something we were able to do because of the partnership with Salvation Army. The Salvation Army has come along to help that kind of come to fruition and be possible. But now all of the parent resources that are on the ParentQ app are available in English and Spanish. That's awesome. And I think also just right now working forward to Orange Conference 2020, there are some conversations, and I don't know how much to talk about now, but I'm very excited about conversations that are brewing that we're trying to learn and listen and get ready for 2020 as we look to the next decade of church, and we kind of look back and go, hey, remember how 20 years ago we saw that these changes needed to happen, and then 10 years ago we saw that these changes need to happen, and 2020 is an opportunity for us, just as it marks a decade, to look out into the future and take what we know are some of the big issues facing the church today and go deep with those issues. And so we are having a lot of conversations about what are those issues, listening to leaders who are learning on those things and saying, okay, 2020, let's look to the future and really talk about what's at stake and what we need to change and what that could look like for church leaders everywhere.
That's awesome. I'm sure everybody's as intrigued as I am. That's one of the things I love about Orange, though. You guys, as a church leader, I try to spend time thinking about the future and innovating and new ideas, but that's not going to be 80% of my job. So it's great that there's people like you who are doing that, especially in the next gen world, and are thinking of things and creating resources and content like It's Personal to help us out. So appreciate that. Thank you for what you do. Thanks for coming on the podcast. How can people connect with you?
Goodness. I'm on Instagram at Kristen_Ivy, and KristenIvy.com is the website. But hey, if you're on Instagram, you want to shoot me a message. If you have ideas about what the church should be thinking about for the next 10 years and the next decade, we're listening. This is a conversation that we're going to be having all year long. We would love to hear from you. Shoot me over a message and let me know some of the things that you feel like we should be thinking about. I love some messages on Instagram. That's usually that's my social media of choice.
All right. There you go. And maybe you'll get some now. You're going to get all kinds of ideas. That's awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for coming back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Nick. It's good to be here.
Well, that was a fun discussion. It's great to have Kristen back on the podcast again. I love how they continue, Orange and Kristen and Virginia Ward, Reggie, contributors to the book, but even the whole organization continues to try to elevate relationships and making it personal and people and all of that, because they're a curriculum and a strategy company, but they want to keep it personal, keep it relational about the things that matter most. Here are a few action items I thought of coming out of that interview. One, of course, is to get the book and to read it. And then you might even teach that or go through that or, get it for your team and read it together so that it's something you can all learn together. And then I think a second action step would be, how can you make it personal with one person? Who can you invest in? Somebody that you care about. Maybe it's somebody who's not a part of any church. Maybe it's somebody who's in the church. Maybe it's a kid or a student, or maybe it's a volunteer. But how can you make it personal with one person? And then a third action step, how can you tell a personal story? We talked a little bit about that. There's so much power in sharing your story and the vulnerability and all of that goes with it. So where can you tell a story that's personal to you, to a group of people that you want to deepen that relationship with and make a better connection and all of that? I think those are 3 things that we could all do. Remember, if you want to get a free copy of the book, share this on social media. Be sure to tag me and talk about who made it personal for you. Tell us a little bit about that story on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter. It's going to be short, I guess, if it's on Twitter. Maybe it's a thread. Do a thread so we can hear more about that story. And then don't miss out on Volunteer Boot Camp next week if you're listening to this when it comes out, Wednesday, August 28th. And we have so many great sessions and voices to talk about volunteers and recruiting and onboarding and all those things. That's going to be great. And I should mention, if you listened to the episode a couple weeks ago with Lisa Milady about launching a preteen ministry, we did update that post to share pics of our preteen environment, something that we didn't have when it launched. The pictures at least weren't there when we launched that episode a couple weeks ago, but now they're there. If you want to check those out, you can do that as well. All the links and show notes for this episode are at nickblevins.com/episode 160. So be sure to check that out. Thanks for listening. I hope it has been helpful. I hope you'll make it personal with somebody and make a connection and build into them this week. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.